Hi Tommy. I've seen the video. I think I agree with most of their comments. As you said, the problem here is how can you determine which objects or which textures need to be baked and which object need to be like probably solved with ray tracing, with this selective ray tracing or selective lighting techniques. So I would give you um, my guess, right? I mean, of course, I don't know exactly the technology they are using. I only see the video. I haven't had time to like go in deep and checking these things. But I mean, seeing the graphics, I think I can spot some tricks, and mostly, I think most of the environments are baked. I'm pretty sure about that, and I will show you how you can spot when something is like completely baked. And I think what they are doing is they are basically separating, instead of baking the entire lighting, like including the specular and diffuse and everything. I think what they're doing is probably separating the the colors baked and obviously the shadows baked in the diffuse channel from the specular. So I think, and again I will tell you why I think is that the case. But yeah, so the thing is, the rule of thumb in terms of baking to decide like which objects should be baked and which objects maybe you need like to cast rays or things like that is uh, mostly depending on the position or movement or possible movement of the lights, and obviously the position of the objects. So if your objects will not move and your light source will not move, right, it means that you can bake everything. So that is basically the rule of thumb. So you don't necessarily, I mean, you don't need like a bunch of artists like checking one by one all the objects in the scene, like for and checking at which moment of the game it needs to be baked or not or whatever. I mean, just if you know your entire environment will not move, right? All the furnitures and sculptures and statues and everything like that. If nothing will move, right? So that's it. Everything is baked, right? Again, I don't know this video game. I haven't played this video game. I don't know how much you can interact with these objects, for example. So, for example, in this part of the scene, you're walking in a hallway in which basically everything is static, right? So let me just go back a little bit. And obviously the quality is really good, and I agree with these guys that they say that the most impressive thing is the art, right? I mean, getting this level of or this realism in terms of lighting with baking techniques, because remember when you bake your lighting you can choose whenever whatever rendering engine you want. I mean, you could use a high-end rendering engine as V-Ray or whatever you want, right? You can be as realistic as you want, right? Because in the end it's offline rendering, right? You can take a lot of time rendering all those textures, all those big textures, and then it's just textures, right? You're just grabbing that information in real time. So there is already technology to do that, right? And usually if you go the to Google and you search for architectural visualization, for example, usually what you will find is like very minimalistic design, architectural design. So yeah, I mean it means that the renders are mostly impressive, right, in terms of lighting. But usually, if you see something modern, let me show you a couple of examples. So this is an example of a modern architecture interior rendering, right? So yeah, it looks pretty realistic, right? I have no idea which render engine are using. I just Google for interior rendering. So maybe this is V-Ray probably. So yeah, it looks really good, but in the end, the objects are not as the texture and the shapes of the objects are not as complex, right? So in the end, it's a very simple image, right? In contrast, something like this image, for example, this looks way more interesting, right? This image is actually very old. This image, if I remember correctly, this is from Benjamin Brosseau. This guy is from Germany. He used Maxwell Render. Maxwell Render is, maybe you remember, we talked about this software before. It was one of the most realistic render engines in the market. This actually is a render engine that does not imitate light, but like really simulates lights and simulates like the physical behavior of every possible material and how it's basically reacting with lighting, right? So, but again, I mean, what is also like driving the attention here is that the objects are very intricate, right? The textures and all the shapes of this like very old furniture, like Victorian furniture. I mean, this carving here is just amazing. So that, I think, is helping a lot in terms of art, in the video game. So I agree with these guys that like the art is just amazing and it's beautiful. And if all this architectural, if all these interior structures were only like flat concrete walls, will not be as impressive, right? But this is super impressive because you have all these intricate things. So now let's talk about the baking. I'm pretty sure that these entire environments are baked. And I think the way they do it is by separating the diffuse channel from the specular channel. So if you remember, this is the example I show you when we were talking about baking, right? So this is one, this the scene I show you, right? Remember this scene probably. So for example, in this case, and this is very old. This is I made these scenes 10 years ago, right? So, and I made it very quickly. But so if you see, for example, in this object right here, the specular is also baked. The specular component is also baked on the texture, right? If I move with respect to this object, the specular is not changing, which for that specific project, that was enough, right? But I think, but one trick is not include the specular component on your baking, and only capturing the shadows and the textures and basically the diffuse channel, the ambient and the diffuse channel. It means that if you only bake that, you can, in your real-time shaders, you can basically, when you're computing your ambient component and your diffuse component, you're just directly getting the color directly from the texture. The texture is already baked, and you can basically just compute the specular level, right? The one that is changing depending on the view direction and also the position of the light, right? Which is basically these things, right? And you're just putting that on top of your baked materials. That is what I think. That is what is happening here, because the shadows are definitely faked. Sorry, the shadows are definitely baked, but the specular is not. So please take a look at how the specular actually changes depending on the movement, right? So see, for example, these speculars, and yeah, but mostly with shiny objects, you could see that it is changing, right? So it's very realistic. Yeah, look at this, right? I mean, it was very white, but now our position with respect to the lighting is obviously different, so now the specular is almost gone, right? So it means that the specular is probably computed with the probably with Fong or something like that, right? And it's just shining on top of a baked texture. The shadows are definitely baked, and I will tell you why. So for example, here, the lighting source, I mean, it seems that there are several lighting sources here, right? But one of those lighting sources are these candles. So maybe here is not as obvious, but when you have a light source as fire or a candle, if it's real time, right, the shadows must be moving, because the candles are all like moving all the time. So you have all the time this like oscillation, turbulence, movement in your candles, and then because that basically that volume of fire is also your light source, it means that it needs to cast shadows differently every time it moves, right? So basically, what happens is that the shadows are next to objects like this, like candles, should have the same like flickering effect of moving randomly with all this turbulence. And again, this is not the case with the candles. And here's another example. So you can see here, I mean, the fire looks very nice, and they have this effect, which is just a shader effect, of course. So they have this effect that the heat of of the of the fire, right, is like deforming the air, refracting the light, right? I think they were talking about that, right? So you can see like how everything is like moving. This is easy to achieve. This is probably a vertex shader. You agree? I mean, you can, for these objects, for the objects that are basically close to the fire, just assign a vertex shader that is just moving the vertices in this like wavy effect, and you can get this very cool effect that is produced in real life when the air is very hot and is basically refracting the light's rays that are coming to your eye, right? But the thing is, if you can see the shadows on this image, and also the shadows when they basically start seeing these fireplace, the shadows are not flickering. Everything except for these flames is basically static, and that is what is telling me that they are definitely baking everything here. Not everything again. I think they're computing in real time the specular component with probably Phong, and the rest of the texture, shadows, and diffuse component is definitely baked. So let me show you an example. So this is a real fireplace. This is how a real fireplace looks, right? So as you can see, the flames are obviously changing all the time, right? Because the turbulence of the heat that they're producing provokes like turbulence in the air, so they're basically moving. And because they are in fact the light source, all the surrounding shadows are just flickering, right? So you can see it here at the bottom. I mean, I will move my mouse. But you can see at the bottom how like the shadows are flickering. So you cannot see that on the video game. It means that the shadows are already baked. I mean, you could have this also, right? I mean, in terms of baking, imagine that what you're doing when you bake shadows or like in general lighting, is just pre-computing information that you will just access that information like very quickly on your video game. So for example, instead of just if I know that the objects are surrounding the fireplace, if I know I desirably I want to achieve this effect of the fireplace making these like flickering shadows, you could in fact bake like different versions of these objects somehow like I mean, I'm not saying that you could like bake a video, but imagine it's something similar. So you could have like different versions of this baking information, and maybe have some sort of like intelligent, like a smart way of interpolating the values of the color depending on some flickering equation or something like that. So you could probably, using baked information, you could probably animate the textures and somehow to give this flickering effect. So I mean, I think that is something that I at least that is how I do it probably, right? Instead of, I mean, because you could also use ray tracing in real time to try to mimic this effect of the flickering, right? Like moving your light sources, but that will be just incredibly expensive, right? So maybe you could just like play with it, right? So as I said, the same will happen with candles. And again, this is if you want to be like super realistic, right? But this is a video of real candles, right? So as you can see, every time the candles are like doing this random motion due to turbulence, the shadow is changing, right? The shadow and the specular values are changing because the light source is obviously moving, right? And so if we return to the game, you don't see that. Even here is probably a better example. In this room in particular, there's only one light source, that is this fire, right? And the fire is like moving too much. It means that in real life, you will need to see flickering everywhere, basically flickering everywhere. And if you pay attention to the shadows, they're very nice, but they're not flickering. They're not changing, right? So for example, this object right here, it has this objects, right? This chain, and this will obviously occlude part of the lighting of this fire. So you would also need to see like a very blurry contribution from the shadows of these objects, but like moving too much. And every object here, every shadow that you can see here, it should be moved. It should be like, it should be flickering because your light source is flickering, and it's not. What they are doing is, as you can see, the light is not constant, right? They are making this effect of like increasing the intensity and decreasing the intensity. That is an old trick in general in graphics in video games. So you have your entire light and shadows already baked in your texture, but you can show that texture with different values, right? It's like getting the image in Photoshop. You can modify the intensity of a photo, for example, in Photoshop. You can increase the value of the of the white sections, or the lightest sections, or the dark sections, for example. So this is what they are doing here. They probably have an algorithm that is mimicking, kind of mimicking the effect, the possible flickering effect of this fire, but it's obviously not affecting the shadows itself because everything is baked, and they're just randomly modifying how much or how is the intensity of the of basically the texture that we are capturing here with the baking, right? And again, in some cases, it's very difficult to perceive that the shadow is not moving. So, for example, I don't know, in this part or in this part, right? The shadow is very small, so sometimes it could be, yeah, maybe not as obvious, but you can look for objects that are creating very defined shadows, and if they're not moving, if those shadows are not moving, it's definitely because it's fake. So for example, this object right here, right, is generating this shadow and it's not moving. The shadow is always the same. If this was real, if this was computed in real time using ray tracing technology, for example, and you already know how to do that, because the light source is always changing and randomly moving, it means that all these very defined shadows of these pairs should be moving, right? Because the light source is basically waving all the time, right? I'm not saying that is ugly. It's beautiful. I mean, it's really nice. But again, I think the contribution here is the artist did a very good job faking everything here. And I don't know if you noticed, but they also have this heat effect in this part. So if you look closely, I think when the camera turns, you will see. Oh, actually, you can see it here, right? So you can see the effect here. See? It's really nice how they're faking the effect that the air surrounding this object is obviously hot and is basically refracting everything. But again, that is just a vertex shader. It's probably just a vertex shader. that is probably checking the direction, the view direction, for example, and it's basically checking that if the triangle that you are rendering, right? So once you're rasterizing the triangle, if that triangle is basically between you and this volume that they could maybe define a volume that represents this area of hot air that will refract the light, right? Well, right. So basically, it's just checking that, right? So if the object that you're seeing is between you and that hot volume, they are probably activating a vertex shader that is mimicking this effect of these like ripples, right? And it's really nice. You can see it here, really, really nice. But they were very creative. I am impressed. It's really, really nice. Again, here's another example. This is a single source of light. The entire scene should be flickering, and it's not flickering. They're just applying the same trick of just randomly increasing and decreasing the intensity, and of course this, for example, this shiny area here, I don't know if this is blood or whatever, but if this is blood, it's very shiny, and the specular values of these shiny materials, those are probably computed in real time using funk, probably, right? Here's also another example in which you can clearly notice that everything is baked, because this area of the room, this part right here, you have a light source here that is very intense, and it's warm, right? The light is warm, and then they open the door, right? And if this were real, when you open the door into a room that is dark, right, you should light these objects, right? So right now the door is open. Behind you is this chandelier, right, with a very shiny light, and somehow that light is just not getting into into this room, right? In real life, it should be, right? It should be entering this room, lighting this thing, and the light should bounce and everything, and suddenly it's not. It means that everything is baked, right? I mean, this room was baked totally dark, and the other room was baked totally lighted, and there is basically no effect, right, when you open the door. Now this is different. So in this case, for example, they are, I guess you have some sort of like a lamp, right? So you have an entire environment that is totally dark, and you're walking, right? And you can see shadows actually casted shadows in real time. This is where maybe they are using ray tracing. I'm not sure. I don't think so, right? But because, so for example, here, if you have a lamp, this part of this shadow, right, is produced by your lamp, right? So you have this barrel, and we have basically the light source is almost in the same place of the camera. So this part of the shadow is basically produced by our source of light. When you're moving, that shadow is also moving. It means that this shadow in particular is not baked, right? So here is basically, it's probably a combination of two things. I think in this case what they're doing, or again, what I would do, is I would probably bake this entire environment with very dark illumination, right? Almost no lighting, so everything will be very, very dark. And then I would probably bake it again with a bit more light, right? As if these materials were illuminated by a light source. So yeah, so it's some sort of having two versions of the baked textures. So one version is, let's say, how the floor looks when it's almost completely dark. I mean, it's not totally dark, as you can see. I mean, if this is the part that is illuminated by the lamp, and this is not, it's not completely black, right? So this could be one version of the baked textures, and this basically is another version of the baked textures, right? So I have maybe I would bake again like two versions, one version in which you have a little bit more lighting, and one version in which is like the almost completely dark version. So then in real time you're shining your lamp, right? So you could, and that is your light source. So you could I mean, even using fawn or whatever other shaders you want, you could in real time compute how much light contribution you have from this lamp, and you could also compute it maybe with using shadow maps, perhaps, right? Like what are the objects that are being lit and what objects are occluded and where are the shadows and everything. And basically what you would do is you could use the diffuse component of your equations, right, to decide in which parts of those objects you're grabbing the texture, the baked texture that represents the object when it's under shadow, and in which other parts you take the baked information when it's under lighting. So what I'm saying is, let's pretend that this entire wall, it's a single object, and let's pretend that it has a single texture, a single big texture that has two versions. One version that is baked with very low light, and one version that is baked as if it were lit by this candle or lamp, right? So depending on how the lamp is basically affecting, right, depending on the place of this lamp is basically affecting this wall, I am either getting the information from the baked version when it's lighting, or getting the information of the baked version when it's not lighted, right? And basically in between I just make like an interpolation. I just merge the two, right? I can just combine the two. I think that could probably make a similar effect. And the shadows, again, you could see, for example, let me just come back a little bit. No. And again, you can see shadows here that are casted right in real time, right? These shadows right here. This shadows right here. Those are casted real time. I don't know if, I mean, if they're ray traced or shadow maps, I don't think they're ray traced. They're probably just shadow maps. But yeah, and this effect of having environments, like baked environments, and mimicking like a light source, like a lamp, it's also very old. That was something that it was done in I think in the very early versions of Quake, for example. Maybe I can find an example. Yeah, so look at this. This is Quake, very old, and look at this effect. They're faking the effect of having a light source that is basically flickering. So what they are doing is everything is baked, right? Like the shadows and everything. And I mean, I played this video game. This is a long time ago, and believe me, these graphics, I mean, they look horrible right now, but at that time we were just impressed. But yeah, but I mean, the shadows are baked, everything is baked, but they basically bake two versions, one when the light is on and one when the light is off, and they're just switching between those two textures. See, it's basically the same. So you can basically do the same depending on the position of your light source, and you could maybe achieve the effect of the lamp that you can see here. Now let's talk about reflections. As you probably remember, again, as I said, the rule of thumb is if the objects won't move and the light source will not move, you can bake basically everything. In terms of ray tracing, usually you need ray tracing if the objects are reflective. That is basically when you need it, right? So, for example, in real life, this table will need to be reflective. Sorry, and it's not. I mean, it has some specular, but I think this is just faked, right? It's just probably a profound reflection, all right? I don't see this object. This is a very shiny object, and if this is also a very shiny wood, I would expect to see the reflection of this object in the wood, and I'm not seeing that because it's very sharp, right? The specular is very sharp, so I'm not seeing that. It means that this object is not casting any rays. I mean, this is just pure funk or whatever, blend or whatever technique you want. However, you can see a little bit of reflection here on the floor. I think the floor in some areas shows a little bit of reflection. The thing is, again, you could maybe only on those materials, only in the certain parts of the floor, because again, I don't see that the entire floor is reflective. So again, this is also part of the artistic trick, right? So maybe in only in certain areas of the floor, only in those, you are actually using ray tracing to maybe get the proper reflection and get a very shiny and cool effect, and that will just make us believe that this is like super realistic. But in this case, because this is planar, I don't think that's the case. So the thing is, remember, whenever you have a flat surface, like mirrors or floor, and you want to fake reflection, in general, in real time, is cheaper to fake it with two passes, right? So remember, you have, I mean, the camera from which we are seeing everything, and you can compute another camera that is basically computing this object, or basically, I don't know, maybe this area, right, from a different angle, right? Basically exactly the angle from which you could see the reflection here, and you're just basically combining those two passes on this texture, right? I think that is what is happening here, because again, I don't see the reflection to be so realistic that could be ray tracing. But maybe it is. Maybe this is ray tracing, but again, it is a very selective ray tracing because it's only happening in a very, very tiny part of the rendering. Happens also here, right? Here you can see a little bit of these shiny sections here reflected, right? So again, this is a huge combination of very smart tricks in terms of technology, but also very smart tricks in terms of art, right? So artists need to also understand the technology very well to know like when I use this and when I use that. And and you were asking specifically again if this selective lighting needs to be like, or could be automatic or things like that. I think your question was, maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I understand it, is I don't know if you were thinking that the light could change in real time. That I don't know, that at some point of the video game, maybe everything is, I don't know, maybe a furniture is baked, and then suddenly, because something happened in the video game, I need to immediately switch to ray tracing or something like that. Again, I don't think it's happening. I think everything is probably very static in that sense. It seems that the entire environment is baked, and it just remains baked. When it could be, in which circumstances you could have that problem. So imagine, and again, I don't know this game, but if you can interact with the objects, that is a problem. That will give you problems in terms of your baked solution, right? So if everything is baked, and suddenly I can grab this furniture and basically move the furniture, it means that the baked shadow will just remain there, right? And I will just remove the furniture. So that will be very bad. If I remove this chair, the lighting must change, right? I mean, now the shadow should be on now the new place under this piece of furniture. So yeah, I mean that is totally a different problem, because now you have objects that are moving, right? So now their shadow will be different every time they move. That is what happens with characters. So when you see characters here, again, I think in the end that is a combination of everything. The characters are obviously not baked. The characters are probably just rendered in real time as usual, generating shadow maps as usual, and of course, if maybe a character has a very shiny object that needs to be reflective, needs to be like very realistically reflective, maybe just in that very tiny portion, you can maybe use ray tracing, right? But but again, I don't think that is the case. Yeah, here is the same, right? I mean, we are not seeing reflections. We're seeing a little bit of reflections on this plate, but it's weird, right? Because we are only seeing reflections on the flat part. We should probably see like a very deformed reflection in this area, and is not there, right? Yeah, but again, this is only my impression. um, I am probably wrong in many things. I'm just guessing. um, and it is a very nice. Oh, actually, yeah, they're saying this, that maybe here you have ray tracing reflections, and yeah, I agree. But again, this is a flat surface, and these reflections could be also achieved with camera tricks. So they're not necessarily ray tracing reflections, maybe, but they're not necessarily. And I mean, if they do, is really nice. But that is why it is selective, right? It's only for those materials that are very shiny, right, that you will need those reflections. Okay, so I hope this helps. If you want to discuss anything in the future, I will be happy to do it. Yeah, bye.